Hi, I'm Becca, and I'm a student at the University of Minnesota. I love Veritas because it has really allowed for my formation and the integration of my faith and work at the Academy. I hope that this episode helps you love Veritas too. Thanks for listening.
I started to realize hey, I'm actually not as good of a person as I'd like to think I am. And all of a sudden, this message that my brother had been telling me about a God who loves us, who offers us forgiveness through the death of his son, that this message really started to make a lot more sense out of my own experience, that I started to realize that I too was in need of that forgiveness.
It's easy to believe that knowledge means reading the right books, watching the right videos, or asking the right questions. But watching a few how-to videos on YouTube doesn't make you an expert. In order to really know how to change a tire, make puff pastry, or play the piano, you have to, do it. Through experience, you discover new dimensions to knowledge. From finding holes in your reasoning, to growing in flexibility and nuance, to even reassessing who you are and maybe even what you believe in. In this episode, you'll hear a story of such a discovery. Our guest today is Dr. Tom Rudelius, a theoretical physicist and string theory researcher with degrees from Cornell and Harvard. When Tom was on the brink of achieving his lifelong dream of becoming a secret agent, he encountered his need for a new way of living. This story, along with others discussed today, is shared in Tom's new memoir that's out this week. It's called Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. Today's episode follows the arc of Tom's book, how he and his twin grew up, to the lie detector test that sparked his faith in Jesus, to the deepening of his faith, even through mental illness, anxiety, and doubt. A note before we dive in. Regardless of your relationship with faith, spirituality, or belief, we're so glad you're listening. This episode is for you. We hope that as you listen to Tom's story, you'll be able to think of your own. Come as you are, listen as you're able, and take what you need. This is the Veritas Forum podcast, a place for generous dialogue about the ideas that shape our lives. This season, we're exploring meaning and purpose. I'm your host, Carly Regal, and I'm the podcast producer for the Veritas Forum. Tom, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. And I just want to say thank you for the vulnerability and the honesty that you shared in your book, Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. It was a really great book to read, and I loved getting to know a little bit more about you and how you, a theoretical physicist, came to have faith in Jesus. For our listeners who most likely have not read this book, could you just give us an elevator pitch for Chasing Proof, Finding Faith and pique the interest of our listeners?
Yeah, so Chasing Proof, Finding Faith is a memoir. So it's my story of how I came to faith growing up in a non-religious family. I came to faith in college primarily through conversations with my twin brother. So it's a little bit about how he discovered faith, a little bit how I discovered it through him, and a bit of the intellectual journey that I took to get there. Some of the questions that I wrestled with, things that bothered me, answers that I found convincing along the way. And it's also the story of my time since then. It's been more than 13 years now since I became a Christian. And in that time, I've had seasons of really intense doubt and anxiety. Some days that I just kind of woke up and was like, wait, do I actually believe all this stuff now? It's a story also in that time when I started in college, I was a physics major. Since then, I've gone to grad school, done a PhD in physics, done a couple of postdocs, and will be starting a faculty job soon. So it's also the story of my journey in science and how that journey in science is kind of intermingled with my journey of faith and how the two have grown together.
Lay a little bit of groundwork for our listeners. Your book begins with your childhood. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like? You mentioned that you grew up in a non-religious home.
Yeah, I grew up in a very loving, but also very non-religious family. I have a twin brother named Steve. So I grew up with him and my mom and my dad. Something I tried to convey in the book is just what it was like. I mean, I think I always felt incredibly loved by my family. And I also felt that they did a good job of teaching me morality, raising me in a good way, even without religion being the forefront. I kind of just never really felt like I had a need for religion because in my mind, the main point of religion was to help people to be happy and to help people to live moral lives. And I always felt that I had both of those things without religion. So in some ways, I'm really thankful for the upbringing that I had. I had school and I had sports, and that was enough. And so, yeah, it wasn't really until for both my brother and I, that we didn't really come to faith until we first understood that actually there was like a need, that somehow our upbringing had left this hole that actually needed to be filled by faith.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a little bit about the water that you were swimming in when you went off to college. So you went to Cornell and your brother went to Northwestern. And could you tell us a little bit about this shocking thing that happened? What happened when your brother went off to college?
In a sentence, my brother became a Christian. In my book, I go into a little bit more of the story of how that happened. He met a guy his freshman year on his floor in his dorm who was like probably the first really serious and outspoken Christian that either of us had ever met. And the incoming freshman had to read a book about Charles Darwin that year. And from there was kind of this natural launching point into discussions about creation and evolution. And that's how everybody in this floor found out that this guy named Matt was a Christian. And I think Steve and a lot of the other guys there were pretty skeptical, and they asked Matt a lot of questions. They kind of grilled him, like, how can you believe some of this stuff? So Steve wasn't convinced, I think, by all of Matt's answers, but what became clear very early on was that Matt had thought a lot more about this than Steve had. And his answers were, if not convincing, at least intriguing and thought-provoking. And so Steve started talking more with Matt, started going to church, and make a long story short, he decided to become a Christian. That's where I really got brought into the story. And I was very surprised because growing up, I was pretty indifferent towards religion. And I think my brother Steve was as well. But if anything, he was probably the more opposed to it. And so he definitely wasn't the one I would have expected to like go off to college and have a religious experience and decide to become a Christian.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's something that stuck out to me from your book. It's clear to me how strong your relationship with your brother is, because this, as you mentioned, you thought your brother would be maybe not the last person to, explore Christianity, but it definitely wasn't high on his list going off to Northwestern. But what I think is interesting is that you responded to Steve's interest in Christianity by not dismissing him, but actually by checking it out for yourself. Can you talk a little bit more about what that was like? And did you have a moment where you wanted to dismiss it all?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, I think I kind of came in with that inclination of this, I just don't think that this is really all worth my time. But I think more than anything, when Steve came to faith, my biggest feeling was one of fear that he was going to change, that that somehow this was going to get in the way of our close relationship, because Steve was my best friend and he still is. And so for me at first, that was a major motivation in starting to talk with Steve, starting to read some of the books about Christianity that he had, and even checking out church with him when we were both home together over the summer. If this is something that's really important to him, so there's kind of this wanting to just investigate faith because that will keep me close to him. So that was really the motivation from the outset. It was less about any sort of like deep need to investigate the difficult questions about life and meaning and purpose, and more just about wanting to see what this thing was all about that my brother had found.
Yeah, yeah. That's really beautiful. With these experiences, you're reading a lot, you're interacting with your brother, you're having lots of deep conversations, thinking through, kind of doing the work that Steve's friend who helped introduce him to Christianity. But it wasn't just through reading and having conversations that you ultimately came to put your faith in Christ. Can you tell us a little bit more about your aspirations?
As a kid, the goal was either be a professional baseball player or become a secret agent. Like, I liked watching sports and playing sports. I also liked watching like James Bond movies. And when I was young, the Nintendo 64 game GoldenEye was in its heyday. That was a classic. And so, yeah, so that was those are kind of the two the two areas. As you say, by the time I got done with high school, it was pretty clear that I was never going to be a professional baseball player. But yeah, secret agent was maybe still on the table.
Yeah. So I thought it was really interesting reading your book, the fact that if you go to college to be a physics major, that actually can sort of be a fast track into being a secret agent. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you as a physics major could actually have one foot in the door on your James Bond lifestyle you always dreamed about?
Right. Yeah. So I was a double major in math and physics, and something I learned is that the National Security Agency, or NSA, is actually like the largest employer of PhD mathematicians in the US. At least that's what they told me back then. I think it's still true.
Someone's got to employ him.
Right, exactly. But yeah, there's a lot of things, I think, especially like cryptography sorts of things that the NSA is interested in that require a lot of mathematics. So they bring in a lot of PhD mathematicians, and they also bring in a lot of college students for like summer internships, like college math majors. So yeah, so after during my sophomore year of college, I applied and got accepted for an internship with them.
It's incredible. I bet you were just over the moon.
I was really excited. Yeah, I was really excited about that.
Yeah. Everything seemed to be going pretty well for you. You had access to what was your childhood dream. Maybe it was a couple of steps away, but still, you go through more of the process of like what the background checks and the math tests and the sorts of things you had to do. But there is one part of qualification for this internship that gave you a lot of trouble. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so you're referring to the polygraph tests. To get a top secret security clearance, which is what I needed, you have to pass a polygraph test. And yeah, I remember when I was, when a woman from the NSA called me to tell me about my schedule and the processing and stuff. She told me that it would be like 4 hours for a polygraph. And I was like, how could it possibly take that long? Because you see a polygraph in movies, it's sometimes known as a lie detector test. And it's just like a really quick thing where they like, ask the person some questions and they answer them. And the polygraph tells you whether they're lying or whether they're telling the truth. In reality, what I found is that polygraphs just aren't super reliable tests. I think the false positive rate is like 35% or something like that. Because really what the polygraph actually measures isn't are you actually lying, but it measures signs like your sweating and your breathing rate and your heart rate. It's measuring, are you agitated, are you perturbed, which it then assumes means that you're lying. So going in, I had these 7 questions that I had to answer. Like, are you a terrorist? Have you ever spied on the United States? And the answer for all of them is just no. Got to say no to all of them. But as we went, I found that there would always be one that was bothering me. And it wasn't necessarily that I was lying, but just that somehow it made me think of something that got me to start sweating or breathing a little bit harder or something. And so they do that. They tell me, okay, that one didn't go so well. Was there a question that was bothering you? I'd be like, yeah, it was this question. And then we talk for a while. Why was it bothering me? What about it is making me react to it? And so we talk about it, and I basically confess everything that I had thought of, and then we do it again. What they're really after is trying to get you to like say what's bothering you, to put everything out there on the table so that you can go back and pass it. Not a very scientific test. You just keep doing it until you pass it. I had to do it probably 5 or 6 times in there. In the meanwhile, just kind of like confessing everything that I could think of that I'd done wrong. Because as soon as I started doing that test, anything that I could think of that I'd done wrong in my life basically just started coming to me and bothering me and making me fail the test. So a lot of tests, a lot of like time of confession. And it indeed ended up going about 4 hours.
Yeah. Yeah. What I think is really interesting about this story is this disconnect between knowledge and experience. So you go into this polygraph test with a very simple objective. There's 7 questions. You already know that the answer to all of them is no. Like, you have not been corroborating with foreign governments. Like you
No.
like
No.
for all
Yeah,
intents
right.
and purposes, like you should be getting that top security clearance. You should be becoming James Bond 2.0, like within the next few years. But even though you have this knowledge of like 7 no's right in a row, you cannot have the experience of keeping your perspiration clean and your heart rate and your breathing rate. It's just impossible for you.
Mhm.
Can you tell us a little bit more about what going through this polygraph test process meant for you on your faith journey?
Yeah. So I credit like the day of my first polygraph as like the day I came to faith. It was like that much of a life-changing experience for me. And I think you really have to kind of understand like where I was with the like conversations with my twin brother, to understand why that was. I was at this point where I'd read some of the books that Steve had given me, and I'd had a lot of the conversations with him. I'd gone to church with him, and the more I learned, like the more a lot of my like intellectual questions had been met, the more Christianity started seeming plausible to me. Certainly a lot more plausible than I found it at the outset. But really, the thing that was still like holding me back was kind of just this feeling of this isn't something that I really need. It's not worth something that's orienting my life around. And I remember very clearly having a conversation with Steve where we got into this argument about whether people are mostly good, like at their heart, or mostly bad. And I felt, people are mostly good. And he said like, no, like everybody's in need of forgiveness. Everybody needs the grace of God, forgiveness of God. And it wasn't really until that polygraph that I really understood that. Growing up, I just always thought, okay, I'm basically a good person. If there's a heaven, I'll probably go to it. I haven't done anything seriously wrong. And that's pretty similar to how I felt going into the polygraph. I mean, like you say, I certainly hadn't done any like espionage for foreign governments. I had certainly never sold classified information about the US. And yet when I got in there, it was like all the little things that started bothering me, all these like very minor crimes, like illegally downloading music and taking fruit from the Cornell dining hall, and just other things, that I like wouldn't want to talk about, but I had to talk about, and like honestly admit all the things that I've done and who I am. I started to realize like, hey, I'm actually not as good of a person as I'd like to think I am. And all of a sudden, this message that my brother had been telling me about a God who loves us, who offers us forgiveness through the death of his son, that this message really started to make a lot more sense out of my own experience, that I started to realize that I too was in need of that forgiveness. And it's kind of like, well, hey, if me too, then it's probably everyone. I don't think I'm such an exceptionally bad person. I think I'm just finally being honest about what my nature is actually like. And so to me, that, it's like when the first half of that message made sense about who I am, then the second half of the message also made sense about who God is. And I think too, something I've kind of reflecting lately as I've written this book and been thinking about this experience a lot more. Something that kind of surprises me looking back is you might have thought that this whole experience of like confession and just like admitting all these things I'd done wrong, that it would have just left me feeling really just like paralyzed with guilt and shame. But actually coming out of the polygraph, I actually felt really joyful. I kind of had just this experience of, and this understanding of God's forgiveness. When Steve is telling me about the forgiveness that God offers, this is exactly what that is for. This is exactly why we need that. And so I actually felt very freed to be able to have shared all of this stuff for the first time, and just joyful to think, hey, that's what this faith is all about.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I love this quote from your book that kind of ties together what you just said. It isn't just the murderers, the drug dealers, the corrupt politicians who need forgiveness. I too am in need of God's mercy. I think something that really stood out to me about the whole polygraph test was the fact that you didn't gain any additional knowledge about yourself or about God through sitting in that room and talking to whoever was administering the polygraph test. Like, you came in as yourself, and knowing the things that you had done, knowing these little small infractions, the second banana that you took instead of just taking one. So at the end of this, it really wasn't the argument for or against Christianity that had changed. It was actually how you evaluated it and how you saw your need for something like the Christian God. Do you have any messages for your past self about this time and about your experience, or things that you wish you could tell yourself, or any advice that you would have?
Yeah, that's a good question. Something I wish, I guess, I'd appreciated sooner was just like the fact that God is in control, and so I don't need to try so hard. I think that was something that really stuck out to me too from the whole polygraph process. How much of like my life to that point, and even since then to some extent, has kind of been like perception management of trying to make sure that people always see like the best side of me. And this is especially clear as I went through the polygraph process, and that was not my only polygraph. I got called back for a few more tests, and it was kind of from that like sort of painful honesty that I had to have in the polygraph process that I started to just like realize like how much I'm tempted to just like tell a little white lie to make myself look better in so many circumstances. And so I think that's something that really came out of this that I guess I wish I'd learned earlier in my life, is just like, it's okay to tell the truth. It's okay for people to just like see the real you and see that you're not perfect all the time.
That's great advice. For listeners who are curious about what ended up happening with the whole polygraph test situation, you failed the first test, you failed multiple tests after that. What ended up happening with the polygraph?
On the fifth one was like clearly the last one, because the internship itself was supposed to start in like a couple weeks. So it was like, okay, either you pass this one or it's just not happening. I took it. They told me I passed it and that security had like approved my clearance. And then a few days later, they called me and told me that my clearance had been rescinded and they didn't know why. And this had never happened before. So I still don't know. I don't especially care. Yeah, it was a pretty heartbreaking, like, it's the kind of thing of, it wouldn't have been so bad maybe if they hadn't got my hopes up. Yeah, so they told me I had it, then they told me I didn't. As I said in the book, I decided to focus on my faith instead.
Yeah. So the dream of being a baseball player crossed off, the dream of being a secret agent crossed off, but the dream of being a theoretical physicist who believes in Jesus, check.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Still got that one. Yeah.
So I think I really enjoyed how your book does not stop at the polygraph test. There is a lot more book after the polygraph test. And I'm going to borrow the phrase that you used in responding to 2 questions ago, this idea of perception management. So you at this point were entering into your graduate studies at Harvard, and me going to Cornell like you did, I have the sense of the way that you need to present when you're in these sort of academic, more selective settings. You have to kind of be on your game all the time. And, if you have to tell a little lie about how you did on that test, how you thought the homework was, you tell it, because, you don't want to seem like you don't belong in this space.
Right. Yeah.
So I think the facets of your life following this polygraph coming to faith experience, that inclination towards perception management was still present. It didn't go away. And you had 2 struggles in particular that you were talking about in your book. The first one was surrounding like this intellectual pursuit. If I really devote myself to theoretical physics, if I really dive all in, am I going to be a Christian at the end of it? Can you talk a little bit more about what your struggles were like in the intellectual sphere?
Yeah. I always saw my sciences and my work as being a part of my faith and being motivated by it, where like a lot of scientists who kind of view their work as uncovering like the mysteries of God, to be able to see it that way and to feel like my research was giving me an opportunity and a bit of a platform to be able to do interviews like this where I'm talking about how my faith and my science helped one another. You've talked about the kind of like the knowledge and the experience, and I feel like that kind of came up again where I had in grad school a couple of really difficult seasons of like fear and doubt. And at first I thought it was kind of just like, okay, I'm having like a faith crisis. Do I somehow I just like don't believe this stuff anymore. What I now realize looking back is that what I was experiencing was anxiety, was like a mental health, was actually like a mental health crisis just playing out in the realm of faith. And that's something that I know is quite common, is like religious OCD, of kind of obsessing about doubts related to faith. And so it was interesting because I didn't actually, those doubts didn't come on by me learning any new material. It's not like, oh, now I have seen this argument that just like completely derails my faith. It was more that just all of a sudden I woke up and like somehow the like answers that I had come to accept and the things that I had come to believe just seemed like they were in question, and like my whole faith was in peril, and I just kind of like needed to obsessively try to answer these questions again and again and again. So that to me was kind of the real difficult faith journey that I went through in grad school, was having to deal with these seasons of doubt that came up kind of out of nowhere.
Yeah. I've got a quote from your book about these mental health struggles, and I'm going to ask you a question about it. It's a little bit of a long quote. Years before, I had come to Jesus in search of a savior, recognizing for the first time my moral imperfection and need for forgiveness. But to get through my season of anxious doubts, I needed a king powerful enough to bring an end to my suffering, humble enough to stand with me through it, and great enough to be worth suffering for. What strikes me from that quote is that you don't expect your struggles to end. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that I've really come to, I guess, like appreciate about the Christian faith, and something that I've really grown to understand more, is just like the importance of suffering, and the importance of suffering in the life of a Christian, and the prevalence of suffering in like the Christian storyline. A lot of us kind of would like to come to the Bible and get like a really clear like philosophical answer for like why we're suffering and for why there's so much suffering in the world. The thing that we see again and again in the Bible is that when people come to God in the midst of suffering, he doesn't so much give them like an answer or an explanation for it, but instead he just gives them more of himself. Like you see this in Job, right? Where Job is having all these things happening to him, all these terrible things happening to him. And finally God answers him out of the storm, and God doesn't explain why it's all happening. He just says basically, hey, I'm God, you're not, and I'm in charge, and I know what I'm doing here. Jesus is like a God who doesn't come and enter into our world and explain the reason for all the suffering, but he just comes and suffers alongside us. He experiences suffering and pain and death. Being able to reorient my understanding of the gospel from just being kind of like, this is how I get forgiven. I mean, obviously that's a big part of it, but ultimately Jesus didn't primarily come to give us forgiveness. He came to give us life, and that forgiveness is like the mechanism through which that happens. And I think kind of, getting to understand and see more of like, what is the life that Jesus comes to bring? And how do I see that even in the midst of like this pain and this anxiety and these difficult times? And that's something that, I mean, I think it really has helped me come to see Christianity, and especially to see Jesus in a new way, to recognize how he meets kind of all of the needs that we bring to the table.
For people who are listening to this podcast who maybe find themselves in an anxious or depressed place, people who are Christian specifically, do you have any advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, so especially for people who kind of resonate with my experience of like the religious OCD, the like really difficult doubts. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say is like, consider the possibility that your doubts might be a mental health issue more than like an intellectual issue. Because I know I for one spent a lot of time trying to like get answers to questions that I now realize, okay, what I really needed was treatment, not answers. That's the first thing, I guess, is like recognize it for what it is, be willing to treat it, and to take a step back from some of the doubts and from some of the questions, and to like return to those when you're in a better place mentally. kind of interesting for me, because my experience at first, it kind of felt like the like religion was the problem, right? That these doubts are all kind of about my faith. And it's like, man, wouldn't it kind of just been easier if I like didn't have my faith at all right now? Because it feels like more of a hindrance than a help. I was challenged on, encouraged to realize my religion isn't the problem. It's just kind of the arena where all of this anxiety is playing itself out. And if I didn't have that, there'd be another arena where it's playing itself out. And so ultimately for me, I started, I guess, to see my faith not as like the cause of, but more like the solution to, or something that could give me like a bit of a balm in the midst of the pain. The suffering, like it still sucks. Like it's really hard, but that I can like have faith and have hope that it's ultimately part of a larger plan and part of a larger purpose. And that's something that I think and probably anyone who's struggling with like mental health issues could benefit from being reminded of, and believing that there is actually as irrational as it might seem, that there's actually like a larger plan behind it.
I also want to pile on this idea you talked about briefly earlier, but the idea that, and I'm quoting you, God is so often viewed as an intellectual question to solve rather than a person to love, worship, and obey. So I think you talk about in your book this shift from God as simply some sort of answer at the end of a long question, and actually like an experience, a relationship, a presence in your life, which I think is quite beautiful.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, that's something that really came out of the periods of doubt and anxiety where, I guess I'd always, it's like God calls us to faith in him, right? And it's like, what do I do with that when it feels like my faith is like on a roller coaster, where like one day or even like 1 hour, like it's like, okay, I believe this stuff. And the next hour I'm like, I just don't know anymore, And kind of, I guess I realized that, like what God is calling me to has to be more stable than that. It can't just be like, if I were to like die right now, then it's like, oh, well, I don't believe. And if I were to die like in another hour, it's like, oh, well, I do believe, And so it's like, I think Martin Luther actually had a similar experience, kind of a little bit different, but like this idea of like, do I need to confess every single sin, every single moment, out of fear that I might like die when I haven't confessed? And yeah, I guess just thinking through that, I came to this realization, guided by some books I read, by things I read and things I heard as well, that the God isn't so much after like intellectual belief. And so I guess what I came to understand and to believe in those times of doubt and anxiety is that what God is after for me isn't so much just an intellectual belief that yes, he is the answer to the question, but rather an allegiance to him, that even in the times of doubt, even when I'm not sure what's true, that I can still take his side against the doubts, and that I can still choose to follow him to the best of my ability.
For my last question today, in your book, you mentioned a lot of things that you read, a lot of conversations that you had, a lot of questions that you felt you got some sort of intellectual answer for. For people who are listening, who are on a faith journey of their own, who are exploring Christianity, what would you recommend they read? Who should they talk to? What food would you give them for the journey?
I can mention a few books that have been important in shaping my faith today. Maybe I'll try to do it in the order, situating them in the faith journey. So the very first book that I ever read about Christianity was one that my twin brother gave to me, that he read too, called Letters from a Skeptic by Gregory Boyd and Edward Boyd. It's a collection of letters, like an actual correspondence, right? Not like fictional made up letters, but real letters that were written between Gregory, who's a pastor, and Edward, who was his skeptical father. And reading the book as a skeptic myself, I'd read Edward's letters, and where he explains, these are the problems I have with religion. This is why I don't think I can believe in God. These are questions that have bothered me. And I'd really resonate, they're just like, he's asking the right questions. How does God allow evil and suffering? How can I believe that humans have free will if there's a sovereign God? All these sorts of things. And time and time again, I guess I found myself surprised by the persuasiveness of Greg's responses, or at least the thoughtfulness of them. I wasn't always convinced. Some of the stuff I thought was kind of weird. Some of the stuff I still think is kind of weird, but it was just like clear that he had thought a lot about this. At the end of the book, Edward actually came to faith. And I think reading it, you can kind of see why.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, sorry, spoiler alert. But you can kind of see why. A book that I'll mention that I don't think actually got mentioned in, I feel a little ashamed of that, but a book that I read at the beginning of grad school that really helped shape the way that I think about the relationship between science and faith is called Where the Conflict Really Lies by Alvin Plantinga, who's a philosopher of religion, very famous philosopher of religion. And in this book, Plantinga basically argues that although there's superficial conflict between theism and science, there's actually a deep harmony between them. And conversely, although there maybe is superficial harmony between atheism and science, there's actually a deep conflict between them at their heart. So I thought it was a really interesting book. And as I say, one that helped really shape the way I think about science and faith as I was very beginning of my scientific career and the very beginning of my faith career. Last book I'll mention is what I do mention in my book called One Life by Scott McKnight. He really, I think, does a great job of explaining what is the gospel, how does it fit into our world, how do we make sense of things like justice, and when Jesus talks about the kingdom of God, what does that mean? How do we fit all of these things into our understanding of Christianity? Last book I'll mention, I guess, is Chasing Proof, Finding Faith, my own book. Hopefully check that out as well.
Yes. I don't know how anybody could be listening to this interview and not want to read this book, but the link to Chasing Proof, Finding Faith will be in this podcast description. So make sure you click on that, order one for yourself, order one for a friend, order a third one just to have around the house. All right. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for joining us.
Thanks. Yeah, it was really great.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast so you don't miss an episode. If you have feedback or ideas for what we can share in this podcast, send us an email at podcast@veritas.org. We love hearing from you. Our production is led by me, Carly Regal, and the team at Resonate Recordings. Thanks to Bethany Jenkins and Seth Bollinger for providing content editing and audio support for this episode, and to Heather Beloga for coordinating all of our production needs. Thanks to our guest, Tom Rudelius, for joining us today. Be sure to order a copy of Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. The link is in the podcast description. Thanks also to our incredible partners who help support Veritas and make sure these conversations are possible. And a final thanks goes to you, the listener. Thanks for listening as we explore the ideas that shape our lives.